You to this program. This is part 3 in a continuing study entitled Behind the Door, a look at the intrigues and designs of the Jesuit order to destroy every Protestant piece of cloth that still remains in our world today, and to analyze from history how the Jesuit order and the Vatican have sought to destroy down through the ages. We have looked already in previous meetings in regards to Behind the Door that the Catholic Church, according to Revelation chapter 17 and verse 3, went into the wilderness at a point in Earth's history, because John was, in Revelation 17:3, it declares that John was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. And it was while he was in the wilderness that he saw this woman, Babylon the Great, sitting upon a scarlet-colored beast full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. We notice that the word wilderness, according to Revelation 12, verse 6 and verse 14, represents obscurity and seclusion. Obscurity and seclusion. And so at some point in Earth's history, the papacy went into seclusion and obscurity. They went behind the door, as it were, hidden away from the sight of Earth's inhabitants, and they would now carry on their dastardly and atrocious deeds in secret. They would use front organizations to carry out their deeds of blood and of destruction, so that they could present, as Ellen White says in the book Great Controversy, so that they could present a fair front to the world, and they could clothe themselves in Christ-like garments, while behind their backs they're carrying a dagger, ready to cut out the heart of anything that breathes of opposition to Rome, and anything that has a vestige of Protestantism left in it. The papacy has their dagger ready, and they have used it many, many times since going behind the door. The question we need to ask ourselves is, when in history again did the papacy go into seclusion and obscurity? And history and the Bible will indicate for us they went behind the scenes in 1798. It was then that they received their deadly wound, according to Revelation 13 and verse 3. So with that in mind, we're going to begin to analyze another event, several series of events that went on behind the door. Now, as an introduction to this tape, I want us to think for a moment, what was the purpose and the time frame for the most notorious council ever conducted by the Roman Church in modern times? Now, I'm referring not to Vatican II, which took place in the early 1960s, but I am talking about the First Vatican Council that was held at Trent from 1545, and it lasted all the way to 1563. The wicked, notorious Council of Trent was designed for one reason. It was designed to destroy what the Protestant Reformation had created. It was designed to destroy everything that was in opposition to the papacy, designed to destroy Protestantism, freedom, of any ilk. We read that the fourth session of the Council of Trent, which is quoted in the book History of Romanism, pages 478, 479, and 488, we read these words: "The fourth session of the Council of Trent was one of the most important sessions of the Council. In this session a decree was passed which placed tradition upon an equality with the Scriptures. Also at this fourth session was exacted severe penal laws against the liberty of the press. The right of private judgment in reading the Scriptures was prohibited, its exercise punished, and the liberty of the press was authoritatively forbidden." And on page 536 of this same document, History of Romanism, the council was concluded with this cry: "Accursed be all heretics." Accursed, accursed. So the wicked Council of Trent was the Catholic Church's, the Jesuit order's counter-reformation designed to destroy Protestantism. With that thought in mind, I would like to ask you a question. What do you think the Catholic Church's view would be of a nation, not an individual, not a church, but a nation that would be founded and established on Protestant principles of the right of man to worship God freely and the right to interpret the Bible according to the dictates of his own conscience, and to worship the God of heaven as he saw freely to do? What do you think Rome's purposes would be for a nation founded on Protestant principles? What do you think Rome's position would be on a nation that was founded on the principles of republicanism, of free speech, of free press, of the rights to bear arms? How do you think Rome would respond to such a nation as that? Since the 13 American colonies were entirely Protestant, and the Republic was established by the Constitution on a Protestant form of government, reason, logic, common sense, and a knowledge of history would confirm in our minds that the Council of Trent, the Roman papacy, and the Jesuit order would have one design for this great land. It would be the absolute destruction of America and all that she stands for. Our republic refused the power and the sovereignty of the Pope, and in so doing issued its own death warrant. When a nation or a church or an individual refuses to submit to the authority of Vatican City, they are finished in earthly terms. Unless God intervenes, that person's life in this world will be over. In a book entitled The Babington Plot, page 46, this book is about the attempts of the Roman papacy to destroy Protestantism in England during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Page 46 of the book, The Babington Plot, it says this: after her accession, Elizabeth had written to Sir Richard Crane, the English ambassador in Rome, to notify the people of her accession. She was informed by His Holiness that England was a fief or a servant slave of the Holy See, that Elizabeth had no right to assume the crown without his permission, that she was not born in lawful wedlock and could not therefore reign over England, that her safest course was to renounce all claims to the throne and submit herself entirely to his will. Then he would treat her as tenderly as possible. But if she refused his advice, he would not spare her. She declined the Pope's advice, and the hatred of Pius and his successors was assured. Now, Queen Elizabeth rejected the divine right of the papacy to rule over and control the kingdom and the throne of England. As a result, it says that the Pope would not spare her because she refused to acknowledge the sovereign authority of the Bishop of Rome. And so what was the result? Because of Elizabeth's refusal, there were at least 5 attempts that the Babington Plot reveals. At least 5 times the papacy sought to assassinate her, but because of a superb secret service group, her life was saved. When the papacy realized that all their efforts to assassinate Elizabeth had failed, they turned to one of their Catholic sons, Philip II of Spain. And in 1580, the papacy and Spain made a deal that they would invade England. And you know what was used to invade England 8 years later? It was called the Spanish Armada. On page 47 of the Babington Plot, it says, later on it was Pope Sixtus X who promised Philip of Spain 1,000,000 scudi to assist in equipping his invincible armada to destroy the throne of Elizabeth. And the only condition the Pope made in the bestowment of his gift, he should have the nomination of the English sovereign, and that the kingdom should become a slave of the church. So that's what happens when a nation rejects the authority or the divine right of popes to dictate and to put into power whom she will. In 1816, John Adams wrote to the president at that time, Thomas Jefferson. And this is from a book called The New Jesuits by George Reamer on page 14. This is what Adams said. Shall we not have regular swarms of them here in as many disguises as only a king of the gypsies can assume, dressed as painters, publishers, writers, and schoolmasters? If ever there was a body of men who merited eternal damnation on earth and in hell, It is this society of Loyola's. John Adams understood the threat of the Jesuit order. Samuel Morse, the man who invented the Morse code, he also understood the conspiracy against the liberties of this great land that the Jesuits had. In his book called Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States, Volume 1, page 4, Samuel Morse says these words, "In this book, we seek to show that a conspiracy against the liberties of this republic is now in full action under the direction of the wily Prince Metternich of Austria, who, knowing the impossibility of obliterating this troublesome example of a great and free nation by force of arms, is attempting to accomplish his object through the agency of an army of Jesuits. The array of facts and arguments going to prove the existence of such a conspiracy will astonish any man who opens this book with the same incredulity." And Samuel Morse, in this book on page 55, he declares this, "Who are these agents? They are for the most part Jesuits, an ecclesiastical order proverbial through the world for cunning, duplicity, and total want of moral principle. An order so skilled in all the arts of deception that even in Catholic countries, in Italy itself, it became intolerable and the people required its suppression." Samuel Morse goes on. In fact, this is another book called The Crisis, or The Enemies of America Unmasked, written by J. Wayne Lawrence, pages 265 to 267. Listen to what Mr. Lawrence had to say. "Do Americans need to be told what Jesuits are? If any are ignorant, let them inform themselves of their history without delay. No time is to be lost. Their workings are before you in every day's events. They are a secret society, a sort of Masonic order with superadded features of revolting odiousness, and 1,000 times more dangerous. They're not merely priests. They are merchants, lawyers, editors, men of any profession, having no outward badge in this country by which to be recognized. They are about in all your society. They can assume any character, angels of light, ministers of darkness, to accomplish their one great end. They are all educated men, prepared, sworn to start at any moment in any direction for any service, commanded by the general of their order, bound to no family, community, or country, and sold for life to the cause of the Roman Pontiff." And what is the cause of the Roman Pontiff? What is his goal? Malachi Martin and the Keys of This Blood made it very, very clear. It is total and absolute worldwide dominion, and he and the Jesuit order will stop at nothing to bring that about. In a book written by Charles Chiniquy, we're going to be reading a few things. Pages 475 and 476 of Chiniquy's book, he declares this. And he is quoting from the priests, sent by the bishops of the United States. "We are determined to take possession of the United States and rule them, but we cannot do that without acting secretly and with the utmost wisdom. Silently and patiently we must mass our Catholics in the great cities of the United States, remembering that the vote of a poor journeyman, though he be covered with rags, has as much weight in the scale of power as the millionaire Astor, and that if we have 2 votes against his one, he will become as powerless as an oyster. Let us then multiply our votes. Let us call our poor but faithful Irish Catholics from every corner of the world and gather them into the very hearts of those proud citadels which the Yankees are so rapidly building under the names of Washington, New York, Boston, Chicago, Buffalo, Albany, Troy, Cincinnati. Under the shadows of those great cities, the Americans consider themselves a giant and unconquerable race. They look upon the poor Irish people with supreme contempt, as only fit to dig their canals, sweep their streets, and work in their kitchens. Let no one awake those sleeping lions. Let us pray God they may sleep and dream their sweet dreams a few more years. How sad will be their awakening when with our outnumbering votes we will turn them forever from every position of honor, power, and profit. What will those hypocritical and godless sons and daughters of the fanatical Pilgrim Fathers say when not a single judge, teacher, policeman will be elected if he be not a devoted Irish Roman Catholic? What will those giants think of their matchless shrewdness and ability when not a single senator or member of Congress will be chosen if he be not submitted to our Holy Father the Pope? What a sad figure those Protestant Yankees will cut when we will not only elect the President, but fill and command the armies, man the navies, and hold the keys of the public treasury. Then we will rule the United States and lay them at the feet of the Vicar of Jesus Christ, that he may put an end to their godless system of education and impious laws of liberty of conscience, which are an insult to God and man. From that, the Catholic priests, with the most admirable ability and success, have gathered their Irish legions into the great cities of the United States. And the American people must be very blind indeed if they do not see that if they do nothing to prevent it, the day is very near when the Jesuits will rule this country, from the magnificent White House at Washington to the humblest civil and military department of this vast republic. And the recent and most current administrations in the White House, let alone the ones of the last 100 years, would tell us that indeed the Jesuit order does rule this country. May God help each one of us to get out the messages that we hold dear as a Seventh-day Adventist people while we still have time in God's great hourglass of history. So according to Chiniquy, according to Lawrence, according to Samuel B. Morse, according to John Adams, the greatest enemy of this great land of the United States would be the Jesuit order, the Catholic Church, designed to destroy this grand and noble republic. One other statement that I'd like to read, and then we will get into some very, very specific people that felt the iron bullet, the cup of poison from the hands of the Jesuits because they refused to submit to the authority of the Roman Pontiff. The following statement that I want to read to you is from a book called Foreign Conspiracy, once again by Samuel B. Morse, volume 1, page 26. The book again, Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States. What do the people of Europe behold in this country? They witness a successful experiment of a free government, a government of the people, without rulers by divine right, having no hereditary privileged classes, a government exhibiting good order and obedience to law without an armed police and secret tribunals, a government out of debt, a people industrious, enterprising, thriving in all their interests, without monopolies, a people religious without an establishment, moral and honest without the terrors of the confessional or the Inquisition, a people not harmed by the uncontrolled liberty of the press and freedom of opinion, a people that read what they please and think and judge and act for themselves, a people enjoying the most unbounded security of person and property, among whom domestic conspiracies are unknown, where the poor and the rich have equal justice, a people social and hospitable, exerting all their energies in schemes of public and private benefit without other control than mutual forbearance. That's what the people of Europe saw. That's what Rome saw. And so the Roman papacy would turn their weapons against this grand and noble republic. And they would go after the leaders in an awful and vindictive way. Now I want you to come down with me to the 19th century, near the time of the great disappointment of 1844, but just a few years prior to that. In 1840, the man that was elected to take office in these United States was a man by the name of William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison had fought in many battles for the young republic, and he was from Ohio, was elected by a large majority. William Henry Harrison, though an older gentleman, was a very robust gentleman. In his inaugural address, William Henry Harrison made these comments: "We admit of no government by divine right, believing that so far as power is concerned, the beneficent Creator has made no distinction among men, that all are upon an equality, and that the only legitimate right to govern is upon the express grant of power from the governed." William Henry Harrison declared emphatically in his inaugural address that no man rules by divine right. That was the exact same thing that Queen Elizabeth had declared, that the pontiff of Rome has no right to dictate who will be in office and who will not be, and what he will say and what he will not say. By those words, William Henry Harrison signed his death warrant, because it was 1 month later that William Henry Harrison was dead. From side one, we concluded with the fact that William Henry Harrison was poisoned to death within 1 month after he took the oath of office. He took it in 1841. He made the statement about the divine right of kings that he did not believe in that, which was a direct frontal shot at the tyranny of the Roman papacy, just as Queen Elizabeth had done. And just like Queen Elizabeth, the Jesuits attempted to kill William Henry Harrison, and in this case they succeeded. According to a book called The Suppressed Truth About the Assassination of Abraham Lincoln, written by Burke McCarty, on page 44 we read these words: "With these unmistakable words, President Harrison made his position clear. He hurled defiance to the divine right enemies of our popular government." Ms. McCarty is talking about Rome when she says that. He did more, for those were the words that signed his death warrant. Just 1 month and 5 days from that day, President Harrison lay a corpse in the White House. He died from arsenic poisoning administered by the tools of Rome. The Jesuit oath had been swiftly carried out. And what is this Jesuit oath? I do further promise and declare that I will, when opportunity presents, make and wage relentless war, secretly or openly, against all heretics, Protestants, and liberals, as I am directed to do, to extirpate them and exterminate them from the face of the earth. That when the same cannot be done openly, I will secretly use the poison cup, regardless of the honor, rank, dignity, or authority of the person or persons. Whatsoever may be their condition in life, either public or private, as I at any time may be directed so to do by an agent of the Pope, or superior of the Brotherhood of the Holy Faith of the Society of Jesus. So William Henry Harrison was poisoned by arsenic 35 days after being sworn in as the President of the United States. Well, you know, I went back to many encyclopedias after reading what Ms. McCarty had stated, and I thought, I want to hear what history says, what books, other books, encyclopedias say about the death of William Henry Harrison. And so I went to several in our local library here in Florida, and again and again and again they all stated that William Henry Harrison died of pneumonia. He got real cold the day of the inaugural, and he died a month later from pneumonia. I found it very interesting because I went to another book that Ms. McCarty quotes from the powerful U.S. Senator Thomas Benton from Missouri, who in his book entitled 30 Years View, Volume 11, page 21, Benton said this: "There was no failure of health or strength to indicate such an event, or to excite apprehension that he would not go through his term with the same vigor with which he began it. His attack was sudden and evidently fatal from the beginning." Now, Senator Benton doesn't come right out and say he was poisoned, but he sure came close. William Henry Harrison was a robust, healthy individual. But it says his attack was sudden and evidently fatal from the beginning. Well, you know, I needed more proof. I was bothered by what the encyclopedias said. And so I spoke with a friend of mine and I said, do you know of any material on the deaths of William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, and the near death of James Buchanan? Well, my friend typed in on the internet, and lo and behold, in the Gilder Learman History Online section, it stated this: that there was a writer by the name of John Smith Dye, who charged that for over 30 years the Southern's largest slave owners and their allies had engaged in a ruthless conspiracy to expand slavery. Now, John Smith Dye wrote a book called The Adder's Den, or Secrets of the Great Conspiracy to Overthrow Liberty in America. And in that book, John Smith Dye stated this: in 1841, agents of the slave power poisoned President William Henry Harrison with arsenic just 30 days after he took office, because he refused to cooperate with a Southern scheme to annex Texas. This left John Tyler, a defender of slavery, as a positive good in the White House. So John Smith Dye, Burke McCarty, and Thomas Benton all concur that healthy, active William Henry Harrison died suddenly with a fatal dosage of arsenic, and that poisoned William Henry Harrison in fulfillment of the Jesuit oath. "10 years later, the man that was put in office as the President of the United States was a man by the name of Zachary Taylor. He was known as Old Rough and Ready. I'm reading again from Burke McCarty's book on page 47, in which it says this: "As these plotters against the Union had tried President Harrison out on the annexation of Texas, they used the invasion of Cuba as the test for Zachary Taylor, and had their plans ready to launch their nefarious scheme in the early part of his administration. But from the very beginning, President Taylor snuffed out all hope of its consummation during his term." Now I want to state to you what would have happened if Zachary Taylor had invaded Cuba. There was Catholic Austria, there was Catholic Spain, there was Catholic France, and there was apostate Protestant England, all waiting, ready to do battle with the United States of America had Zachary Taylor invaded Cuba. And what chance would this young republic have had against the united powers of Catholic Europe at that time had Zachary Taylor invaded the little island of Cuba? And of course the papacy well understood this, and that's why they pushed Taylor so hard to invade. In Taylor's opening address to Congress, his first message to Congress, Zachary Taylor said this: "Attachment to the union of states should be fostered in every American heart. For more than 50 years, during which kingdoms and empires have fallen, this union has stood unshaken. In my judgment, its dissolution would be the greatest of calamities, and to avert that should be the steady aim of every American. Upon its preservation must depend our own happiness and that of generations to come. Whatever dangers may threaten it, I shall stand by it and maintain it in its integrity to the full extent of the obligations imposed and power conferred upon me by the Constitution." And then, as Burke McCarty states on page 48 of her book, there was no quibbling in this. The pro-slavery leaders had nothing to count on in Taylor. Therefore, they decided on his assassination. So according to Burke McCarty, Zachary Taylor was also killed, assassinated by the Jesuit order. He was poisoned to death. Now there's some very interesting things around the death of Zachary Taylor. Even in the encyclopedias, they will tell you that following his very sudden death, his wife refused to have an autopsy done, and he was quickly buried. 141 years later, many descendants of Zachary Taylor who were studying into the sudden demise of their great ancestor, and knowing that an autopsy had not been done on his body, they demanded that his bones be exhumed and studied to see if he was indeed poisoned. Tragically, his bones were taken to the University of Kentucky, which is controlled by the Roman Catholic Church. And can we guess what the results were? The Catholic people that examined his bones declared he died of natural causes and was not poisoned. Well, you know, having read all of that, it sounded very suspicious based on what Ms. McCarty had said and what all the encyclopedias will tell you. Well, I found John Smith Dye to be a ready helper in this case too. Because in the book The Adder's Den, John Smith Dye declares, in 1850, Zachary Taylor alienated the slave power, which were the Jesuits. They were behind slavery in the South. He alienated them by opposing the extension of slavery into California. 16 months after taking office, the slave power used arsenic to murder the president. He was succeeded by Vice President Millard Fillmore, who was more sympathetic to the Southern cause. Zachary Taylor, because he would not capitulate to Rome, also died of arsenic poisoning. 3 years later, a Northerner, a New Hampshire Democrat by the name of Franklin Pierce, was heading for his inaugural address. Just 3 weeks before he was to take his oath, Franklin Pierce, his wife, and son were in a tragic railroad accident. Tragic because Franklin Pierce's only son was killed. And throughout the remainder of his single term in office, Franklin Pierce's wife was an absolute recluse. She always believed that God had punished her and her husband through the death of their son for their leaving the small cities and towns of New Hampshire for the wild ride of Washington, D.C. What effect do you think those events had on the presidency of Franklin Pierce? He was literally a puppet. He was literally a nothing throughout his time in office because of this tragic event. John Smith Dye believes in his book The Adder's Den that the Jesuits of Rome tried to kill Franklin Pierce in this railroad accident in order to stop him from getting into the presidency. 4 years later, James Buchanan was to be brought into the White House. James Buchanan was a Pennsylvania Democrat. James Buchanan had wined and dined with the Southerners, and it appeared as though James Buchanan would go along with their desires. Burke McCarty on page 50 of her book says the new president proved himself a decided trimmer. Although he was a northern man, he had strongly courted the southern leaders and given them to understand that he was with them heart and soul. In short, he double-crossed them. James Buchanan had had his ear to the ground and had heard the rumble of the abolitionist wheels. And so James Buchanan James Buchanan made it very clear to South and North that he was the president of all. This change of attitude was indicated by his very decided stand against Jefferson Davis and his party. And Buchanan made it known his intention of settling the questions of slavery in the free states to the satisfaction of the people in those states. James Buchanan, like Harrison, like Taylor, like Pierce, and like Queen Elizabeth and many others before him, made it clear that he was not going to go along with the agenda of the Jesuit order. And so what happened? Let me read it to you from the New York Post, March 18, 1857. Listen carefully. On Washington's birthday, Buchanan's stand became known, and the next day he was poisoned. The plot was deep and planned with skill. Mr. Buchanan had a table and chairs reserved for himself and friends in the dining room at the National Hotel. Buchanan was known to be a tea drinker. Southern men prefer coffee. To make sure of Buchanan and his northern friends, arsenic was sprinkled in the bowls containing the tea and lump sugar and set on the table where he was to sit. The pulverized sugar in the bowls used for coffee on the other tables was kept free from the poison. Not a single Southern man was affected or harmed. 50 or 60 persons dined at the table that evening, and as nearly as can be learned, about 38 died from the effects of the poison. President Buchanan was poisoned, and with great difficulty his life was saved. His physicians treated him understandingly from instructions given by himself, for he understood well what was the matter. Since the appearance of the epidemic, the tables at the National Hotel are almost empty. Have the proprietors of the hotel or clerks or servants suffered? If not, in what respect did their diet and accommodations differ from those of the northern guests? There is more in this calamity than meets the eye. It's a matter that should not be trifled with. James Buchanan was poisoned but lived because he knew that he had been given arsenic poisoning. He knew because he knew the history of Harrison and Taylor. John Smith Dye declares the exact same thing. He says, Buchanan and friends dined at Washington's National Hotel. Southern agents sprinkled arsenic on the lump sugar used by Northerners to sweeten their tea. But Southerners drank coffee and used granulated sugar. No Southerners were injured. According to Dye, 60 Northerners were poisoned, including the President, and 38 died. Now, according to this person, Gilder and Learman, they say this is a sensational allegation. Well, I think Gilder and Learman need to go back and read the New York Post of March 18, 1857. James Buchanan was poisoned, almost died. The Jesuit order, they fulfilled their oath again that they would poison, kill, do whatever was necessary to remove those who would oppose their plans. It's interesting, as I shared with my young children today, some of the things we discussed recently about the destruction of the Titanic. My youngest daughter looked at me and she said, Dad, that's evil. As I think about what we have looked over this tape, the things we have talked about in light of the history of England, of Queen Elizabeth, of Harrison, of Taylor, of Pierce, and now of James Buchanan, I can think of no better words to describe than those used this morning at breakfast. This is evil. Just prior to the election of James Buchanan, there had been a very, very famous decision in 1856 that had been passed by the Supreme Court of the United States. The Chief Justice of the United States at that time was a fanatical Roman Catholic by the name of Judge Taney. And in the decision that was brought down in the case of Dred Scott, the decision was basically made that Negroes have no rights which the white man had to respect. In this case, Dred Scott was a runaway slave, made his way to a free state, the state of Kansas. But even though he was now in a free state, by law, Dred Scott had to go back to the southern state from which he came. Because according to the fanatical Judge Taney on the United States Supreme Court, Negroes have no rights which the white man is to respect. With that in mind, as the final years of the presidency of James Buchanan came to an end, there was a rising young man from the state of Illinois who in his debates with Stephen Douglas came out very, very strongly in opposition to the wickedness and evil of slavery in America. He had declared at one point, "As long as God gives me a heart to feel, a brain to think, or a hand to execute my will, I shall devote it against that power which has attempted to use the machinery of the courts to destroy the rights and character of an American citizen." So Abraham Lincoln determined that he would do all in his power to oppose the inroads of the papacy. As a result, we find in Burke McCarty's book on page 42, it states this: Abraham Lincoln was the third president assassinated. 2 before him had been assassinated with the poison cup. Indeed, poison had been administered to President Lincoln as well, according to the Charles Selby letter to John Wilkes Booth, which was a conspicuous government exhibit in the trials of Mrs. Mary E. Surratt and the other conspirators, which stated thus: "The cup failed us once, and might again." The Jesuit order, before they inspired John Wilkes Booth to murder Abraham Lincoln, had already tried to poison him. Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War, why was it fought? Who were the Northerners, who were the Union forces really fighting against in that awful bloodbath of the 19th century? Who was it that assassinated Abraham Lincoln in 1865? Who was behind the hand of John Wilkes Booth? We're going to look at and answer all of those questions in our next tape together, called Behind the Door, Part 4. Let us pray. Loving Father in heaven, help us to do all we can to help, to educate, to warn all those that we possibly can as to the things that have transpired in the world, in our country, against Protestantism for the last 500 years. Please bless us with strength to carry out and fulfill your work in this earth. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. In our next broadcast together, we'll look at the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln and who really brought his demise. Until we meet again, may God richly bless you.